Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Leadership Launchpads Pick and Mix podcast, and we are graced with I was going to say genius then,
Well,
Brad. I don't know. Yeah, Bradley Busch is with us today, and I'm just going to load up the slides while we do a little bit of chat. But this is fascinating for me because I I call myself like a pseudo kind of academic, and so well. Brad is in my mind, the perfect kind of balance of who's someone who knows their stuff, but is able to communicate that in a way that is palatable to everybody. And without kind of bigging him up too much before we get into this, that's why we connect and why I'm so kind of chuffed that he's here today. So he's a psychologist, and we'll get into that in a moment. And works for Inner Drive, which if you haven't heard of them, amazing kind of organization that we'll do links and stuff later. But let's get cracking then and tell us a little bit about kind of what your job is then, Brad.
yeah. First of all, thanks for the kind introduction. I definitely don't deserve some of those praises, but I will take them nonetheless.
Yeah, nice.
And it's lovely to be on the pod because I love your work, and I think we have a similar philosophy in how do we distill information to people. So really is a pleasure and a privilege to be here. So my job at the Inner Drive, we are a CPD provider. We work with schools and colleges to do either in person or through our Teach CPD Academy, ongoing training, mainly around cognitive science, but basically any areas that schools are interested with a teaching learning perspective. We tongue-in-cheek refer to ourselves as Google Translate for research.
I love that.
I think, so my job now is basically, my normal title is psychologist. When I'm feeling pretentious, I call myself a research translator or illuminator. Because I generally think there's like gold in the research, but I get really, really frustrated that it's locked behind paywalls. Yeah. It's really inaccessible. And often most research isn't written for teachers. Most of it's written for other researchers. And actually there is genuine gold, I think, in that research. And we think, if we can make it accessible and put it in front of people who would benefit the most, teachers, that it can inform their decisions. And so we don't see our role as ever telling people what to do. We think we try and summarize the key principles of research and give people time and space to reflect on if or how they can apply that to their practice and their context.
Yeah, I love it. And what a timely thing to be doing when teachers and that are so overworked and all those sorts of things. So great. Well, give me a bit of a sense of why. I mean, I guess you were a psychologist before that. Why not?
Yeah. So I trained initially as a sports psychologist. So I worked mainly in football. Worked with a few Premier League players and teams. Worked with Team GB, Olympians and Paralympians, and really enjoyed the sport side of things. But after a while, kind of found not the most fulfilling in the sense of teaching millionaire footballers how to kick a ball better. It's fun and it's cool and and it can inspire people. So there's real value in it. But, I just kind of wanted to make more of a positive impact. And so my colleague, Edward Watson, who founded Inner Drive, who I work closely with, we made the conscious decision to focus on education because we generally believe education is transformative. And we do believe that if you're interested in things like social mobility and social justice and helping people reach their potential and even surprise themselves, that education is the domain we can have the most impact. And I think we made that decision at the time where, certainly in the UK, people were becoming much more evidence-focused. And so we were lucky that we had a receptive audience to it and haven't ever looked back.
Nice. And I guess that role's super varied. So how does like a typical week look?
Yeah, varied. So I'd say each week we would probably we deliver training both in person to schools and colleges. So inset days, twilights on things like memory. At the moment, we're getting a lot of requests for stuff like, was the research there around AI in student learning, motivation, resilience, self-regulation, those sort of areas. So we do a whole bunch of training on that in person. I take a bit of a lead developing some of the content for our academy. So, for example, producing modules that schools can access, one of my favorite parts of the job is I get to interview researchers and educators to kind of get them to explain their own findings in just 5 minutes.
Yeah, nice.
And so that's just from a selfish perspective, amazing for my own CPD,
Yeah, of
because I
course.
get in touch with lovely people. And yeah, working with schools and colleges all over the world, really.
That. And that's such a cool idea that, you know, you could position yourself as someone where, you know, someone like myself or a trust or a school could say, can you do some of the heavy lifting on this topic and then turn it into something that we can kind of consume?
And that's the interesting thing, I think, for me is I think there's so much expertise within schools and within trusts, but on the same basis. So one of the research papers that I read recently on retrieval practice, it was really, really complicated study. It took me about 2 days to get my head around this one study, but I think the findings of it will be really warmly received by people in training, but no one in that room has 2 days for that one research paper. And so, yeah, we are quite lucky that we get to be kind of that middleman between the researchers and educators.
Right. Well, I'll make a list of all the things I don't currently understand and I'll send them over to you.
That's what I can do.
It'll be a long list. Well, for people that are new to the podcast, we have a sort of set structure, and Brad's kind of made some choices ahead of time around what he's going to talk to us about. He selected a couple of Launchpads from the book. He selected a couple of ignition points, you know, moments in his life that have caused a transition or a transformation, and also some of these fast friends questions, which are usually quite amusing, at least.
I tell you what, there were some good questions in there as well.
Interesting ones in there, isn't there?
Yeah.
So we'll get started with that, really. I mean, the first question that Brad chose was this. If you could wake up tomorrow having gained any one quality or ability, what would it be? So, yeah, what was that be?
God. Am I allowed to stall for time and ask you what yours is, or do I have to go first and kind of say my answer?
Tomorrow. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind would be flexibility. I am so my toes.
Yeah. I would probably go for, I would just wish I would pay money to have more time. So from a professional standing is, I think there is so much work to be done. And the work is so important that I just want to do more of it.
Yeah.
And if I had more time, I could make more impact and do more things. And then, so I've got 2 young kids, and being a dad is probably one of my favorite things.
Yeah.
And so then you have a trade-off of balancing work responsibilities with home life. And I would love to be able to do even more time with them. So if you could somehow figure out how I can get 28 hours in a day, I'd be your new best friend.
Well, it's funny that you talk about kind of time in the day, because when I think about what you just said, I feel a kind of connection in that I'm a bit grumpy about how old I am.
Oh, you don't look a day over 24. What do you mean?
I'll tell you what, you'd be surprised. I've got a good face cream because I am literally like proper old. But it frustrates me that all of us, I guess, are, eventually going to run out of time. But I'm just a bit like, oh, God, I'm so excited about what I'm doing. And I wish I could just have another 20 years of doing it.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that.
That's funny. All right, well, let's keep going because that's a good starting point. And so this next thing, as I sort of alluded to, is this thing called an ignition point, and something that's happened to Brad that's kind of made a change. So we've got another one coming up later, which is a little bit more sensitive, and we'll talk about that when we get out to it. But let's do the first one. What were you like before? What happened? And then how did you transform?
Yeah, so I thought it's a really interesting question, not one that I've actually ever been asked before, which makes you kind of think you'd actually take time. It's a good way to take time to reflect on things. So I guess my first kind of ignition point would barely be a thing that I think had a big impact on me is I think about my family, my childhood growing up. So my family aren't from England. We emigrated when I was quite young from South Africa. And so my parents, I look back on it now and I kind of go, they didn't have any family in the country, only knew a handful of people. And I think I'm pretty inspired by them. So, we had a fairly modest background growing up at a house that didn't have a garden, for example. And I just look at my dad, who kind of worked really hard and worked his way up as an accountant. And I remember seeing him work sometimes on weekends, and going with him to work was one of my favorite things. And that kind of time and being able to sit in his office. My mum worked in social care. And this was obviously before the days where people had things like the internet and Skype. So to be able to communicate with family around the world was really difficult.
Yeah.
And, we used to everyone chip in and do like evening works. My mum used to pack chocolate boxes, and all the money raised was then for our trip to go back and see family kind of once every 18 months. And so I think I've always been quite inspired by my parents, how they worked hard. They forged a path, which I think is always quite impressive. I've always, for example, so my wife, just as like kind of side note, she was the first one in her family to go to university.
Right.
And I've always been impressed with people who'd be like first generation university, because it's like you've actually forged a path as opposed to just falling into things. And I kind of think of my parents in a similar way. And yeah, provide a nice template, I think, both professionally of how to work, but also just personally about how to be a good family person, be a good friend. And so, yeah, they were probably my, that sort of, I think that immigration and coming to a new country was a big part for us.
Love that. And there's something obviously linked to leadership there around just being a role model, isn't it? There's a Launchpad coming up in volume 2 called Latent Learning.
Okay.
And it was new to me.
I don't know the phrase.
Most of them, I kind of learned these phrases and then and it was the idea that you may not know you're learning something at that point.
Yeah.
Because it's latent, it comes around at a later date sort of thing. And I think that's an interesting one, isn't it? When we're kids, we don't realize we're learning from our parents. But yet, when we then suddenly later on, when we've got characteristics of them, we're like, oh, right.
Someone once told me about parenting is you either kind of copy what your parents do,
right?
Because that's your template,
yeah.
or you rebel and do the opposite.
Yeah.
Either way, you're heavily influenced by them.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting. I think it is similar to leadership, because I look at people who I work with and have worked for. So my colleague who I mentioned earlier, Edward, there's something about his leadership style that makes me want to do good work.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to quantify why that is and what it is. But part of it is by leading by example, I think. I think that's a huge thing.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And as we just said, similarly to your parents, leaders should be careful, because they're either modeling what to do or modeling what not to do. And of course, we'd all like to be that way around. Okay, that's great. Well, let's literally launch into the first Launchpad. For new listeners, the idea behind this is that Brad's looked through the Leadership Launchpads book. And
indeed.
There we go. Yeah, he selected a couple of Launchpads that resonate with him. And what I'll do initially is just kind of give a quick summary of where it came from in my mind. And then we'll ask Brad why it resonated with him. This one's fascinating because the blurb talks about this idea that we need to avoid a bias towards recruiting what we would be seen as kind of superstars or, people that are on their like a fast track to the top. And we should really value those that are what could be a corresponding term of rock steady in just their attributes. And it came about actually from watching that baseball movie. I think it's called Moneyball. It's got Brad Pitt in it. And it talks about this when it shows in the movie, this baseball team called the Oakland A's. And they pioneered this kind of crazy recruitment strategy where they moved away from these superstar kind of home run hitters, and then just lent into these kind of dependable kind of people. And it made me then think it was sort of linked to some of Kim Scott's work in her kind of Radical Candor book, where she talks about this idea of in any organization or team, it's a fairly blunt kind of characterization, but you've got superstars and then rock stars. And as the image sort of suggests, you've got superstars that are kind of on the way up and then rock stars that are happy to kind of be where they are. And these superstars are kind of ambitious. They're fast track individuals who are constantly kind of seeking growth and new challenges. And they get kind of restless if they're static for too long. And then I guess it would be a continuum, of course, but the opposite of that would be a rock star, where they are kind of highly dependable, highly skilled, who are just kind of, they get their satisfaction from not necessarily moving up, but just being damn good at what they do. And so when I was doing it, I was just thinking, it's really fascinating for leaders in schools and this idea that maybe some questions we need to ask ourselves are, how do we build a successful team? Because you couldn't have a team of superstars and you couldn't have a team of rock stars. You'd have to have a bit of a balance. Something around motivation. So, again, Kim Scott talks about that motivating a superstar is different to motivating a rock star, which is fascinating. And then potentially we also have to think about how we lead and manage those people, which is, I guess, intricately, linked to the motivation. And the last thing I thought about was, of course, it's dangerous, like mostly dangerous to think in kind of extremes. And so this idea then that, both people bring kind of value to a team. So why did it resonate with you, Brad?
So, by the way, I think that's a great summary. So it resonated with me. So I loved the original book by Michael Lewis on Moneyball. I didn't really follow baseball, so I only understood about 2/3 of the book because obviously all the terminology specific to baseball went over my head. But so the guy who wrote the book, Michael Lewis, he's an amazing author. So he wrote The Big Short. He's just done a book on Sam Bankman-Fried on like the crypto crash. So just a really interesting author, I think. And what I found interesting, so those sort of 3 questions that you put up there, is I think recruitment is one of the hardest parts of leadership. I describe my own success rate about a coin toss. I'm 50-50 for like the most amazing decisions and some of the most terrible ones over the last 15 years. And that's because I think it's so hard because the interview doesn't reflect the job in any way, shape or form. And people who interview well aren't necessarily the people who represent the values and characteristics that you're actually trying to recruit for. You can put on a show for half an hour, essentially. So I think recruitment is the hardest thing. And because it's so hard, why this idea of getting on base I find quite interesting is because it's so hard, we often have a poor idea of what we're actually recruiting for. So we tend to recruit people who are like us. We tend to have those sort of biases. I think the recruitment stage often disproportionately favours extroverts over introverts, for example. And what really the kind of theme from that book was actually it's all about identifying value. What do other people underappreciate for incorrect reasons that actually give you a competitive edge? And I think there's a lot to be said for leading a team once you have the team, but you have to pick the right team to start with. And so I think that recruitment thing is just really, really difficult. And then the following thing I think that builds on is that second bullet point of how do leaders alter the way they motivate people? From a psychological perspective, and this is something I struggle with as well, is we know one of the key things that people crave is a sense of fairness. Like when you have unfairness, you see it all the time. That sets emotional alarm bells ringing more than anything else. You see it in your kids, you see it in your colleagues. It's why, by the way, performance-related pay was a terrible idea in teaching, because teaching is very much reliant on not just you and what happens in your 4 walls, but beyond it. So we know fairness really matters, but yet on the flip side, we know people have individual needs and challenges. So to be personal, I do have to treat people differently. So how do I balance treating people differently to meet their individual needs, superstars or rock stars, versus the sense of fairness and consistency? And I don't have an easy answer for that, if I'm honest, which is why I think it's just such a fascinating thing to try and figure out.
Really fascinating. And when I did a bit more work and reading after making the Launchpad, this idea that you can be a superstar and a rock star at different points of your life.
Right.
As well. This idea that, we talked about having children and that, maybe that is, an influence that causes you to slow down a little bit, and to maybe not be, And then the other thing it made me think about, which I've been a little bit of a victim to, is that kind of sometimes you move past a sweet spot because you're on some sort of ill-perceived superstar trajectory.
Right.
I sometimes joke, which, I had a role once, they wouldn't exist now because of funding, but I was the leader of e-learning in my school. And it just basically meant that Dell and Microsoft and all that would just send me to tech and go, "Hey, Chris, try this out with your kids, will you, and give us a bit of feedback?" And I was like, "Yes, I will."
Yeah.
But it never, it wouldn't exist now. So yes, exciting. Okay. Well, let's keep pushing on because this is great so far. So the next thing we're going to dip into is your kind of second fast friend question. And so this one is an interesting one. So for those that are just listening, if a crystal ball could tell you the truth about yourself, your life, the future, or anything else, what would you want to know?
So I would love to tell you something that we wrestle with a fortune at Inner Drive, like generally kind of keeps us up at night type level of wrestling with ideas, is you read a research paper, you put together some training, a blog, a book, a graphic, whatever the thing is, and you kind of send it out in the world. And you kind of hope it has this like ripple effect that other people will read it, or they'll resonate, or they'll do something with it, and it will lead to change. And that change will be positive, and that positive change might lead to more positive change. And you never really know if the stuff you're doing, what impact it actually has in the world.
Yeah.
And therefore, it's really hard to know how to do it better, because it's quite hard to actually get feedback. Like people can tell you if they enjoyed stuff and if they like it, but like, is the world or is this person's life materially different? Or is it a case of there is no sliding doors and they actually just disregarded what you did and their life continued the same? So if I could have a crystal ball, I would cheat and ask it two questions, really. I'd ask it like, what sort of impact or ripple effect are we having at work?
Yeah.
And how can I do it better?
I love that. Yeah.
Like, I think I'm being clear, but that's because I know the content. It's kind of like this curse of knowledge.
Yeah.
Once you know stuff, you know it.
Yeah.
But how can I explain things better? How can I visually demonstrate some of the ideas we talk about better? I'd love the crystal ball to be able to tell me that.
Yeah. And that's something I guess leaders, need to have in their minds all the time, don't they? Like, check the impact. Think a lot about, obviously my role is, professional development across the trust. And for me, that idea of, and the research is quite strong on this, really poor transfer of training.
Yeah.
People attend a session, they enjoy it, they give good feedback, and very little changes in their practice. Yeah. And it's such a complex equation.
Yeah, honestly, it is. So I'll give you an example of it. So when we first started, so before we did teacher CPD, we did a lot of student workshops. And there's this, we used to play a video at the end of one of our sessions, like really kind of cool, inspiring, upbeat video. And then you give people the feedback form afterwards, and they're like, yeah, it was brilliant. I loved it. And I'm going to do X and Y and Z. And we pretty much just maybe caught them when they're on a bit of a high after the cool video, right? And now with our staff CPD, one of the reasons we actually do our Teach CPD Academy, this online platform, is I'm now convinced you do need that initial spark to like drive change, but you also need this drip feeding, this time to embed, this time for trial and error. And that's why we kind of did our academy, because we don't just want to be the person on the day who does this motivational talk. We want to lead to genuine change. And I think you have to have this drip feeding of ongoing, checking for impact, adding a bit more content each time, tweaking it. I think that stuff really matters for change.
I think you're absolutely right. And of course, it aligns with, what we think we know about learning, doesn't it? That it's built in layers and, that sort of thing. Yeah. Okay. Well, before we get onto this one, we do have to do a little bit of a trigger warning. Brad's been really, gracious in sharing what is quite a vulnerable story. And so, there's just sort of, I guess, a heads up for that. So, Brad, tell us a bit about kind of this second ignition point that happened in your life.
Yeah, so I we were telling just before, weren't we? I was in two minds if I should talk about this, because I didn't want to be a downer or anything like that. But the question you asked was, what has had a big impact and motivated you and inspired you? And I think this was a big one for me. So during COVID, during the first lockdown, so my wife and I, we lost a baby quite late into the pregnancy. And it was quite an intense time anyway for that situation. But I think everything was just multiplied a bit in COVID. So, there were some doctor's scans that I wasn't allowed in. When you do a funeral, you weren't allowed to like hug family members. So it was all very, very intense. And it was quite a random thing that happened. Like there was no logical reason to it. And I think anyone, when you have this big event that's shitty and unplanned, is you kind of start to question everything. So like, we make all these plans and then random stuff happens and you kind of go, what's the point in what I'm doing? Do I need to change my job, my life, and you kind of go through these kind of big self-reflection kind of processes. But I had a bit of a reflection time because a lot of my training is designed around, if you do X, then hopefully Y will happen. And then you have this big random event that kind of just laughs at those sort of plans. And so it kind of made me think about what I wanted to do professionally quite a lot. And after some time, the eventual kind of conclusion I came to was, if I'm going to be doing stuff, I want to do stuff that really matters. And I want to do stuff on scale. So I want to make big impact. And I'm only interested in doing stuff now in just genuinely high quality. I very much go to the life is short. You don't know what's around the corner. So you got to make what you do your masterpiece. You got to do it well. There's no point doing stuff half-hearted. So I think that was a real driving point for what we now do at work here is we want to do stuff that is meaningful. And I think working in education and teacher development and leadership, in fact, is one of the most noble and important things we can do for society. So then the question is, how do we just do it brilliantly? And how do we do it that it makes as much positive change as is humanly possible? And so, yeah, that was a real driving point because that I could have gone a different way.
Yeah, could have.
And actually, it's a real motivator to kind of not make it a complete wasted event and actually turn some good from it.
Yeah, and we talked offline before we got started about how, however reluctant we feel, to share these things. I think you talked about your wife. There's some value in sharing our vulnerable times because it potentially opens a door for other people to be vulnerable.
Yeah, and it's tricky, especially as a leader, right? Because you want to project an image of strength, of knowledge, of, follow me because I know where we're going. And the fear is, if you're vulnerable, you're worried that people might view you in a different way. And what I found is, the support I got from my team was just incredible. And the support I got from my friends who had actually gone through similar things, but hadn't really spoken about it amongst the group. I don't know if that's a male thing in part, potentially, but so it brought me closer to people and definitely made me have more empathy moving forward as well. So yeah, not a situation I'd ever wish on anyone, but can take the reflections and positives from it.
Great. Well, again, I really appreciate you sharing that, and I'm sure lots of the listeners will resonate and feel a connection that we just talked about. Okay, well, let's move on to the second launchpad. And this one is, for me, fascinating. And so I'll do a little bit of brief intro again. This idea that kind of experience is not enough. And when I was making it, I was thinking about, this idea of just because you've had a job or just because you've been in a role for a reasonable amount of time does not guarantee that you are an expert or that you are developing expertise. And so, we have to proactively, as the slide says, and regularly utilize the benefits of reflection. And when I was building it, I was thinking, okay, maybe it's a bit like a kind of, a graph. So if we had expertise up one side and then time along the other end, for someone who's just in a role, and we'll take myself, for example, I've suddenly become a senior leader, and I've been a senior leader for 10 years. And so it's not that I'm not gaining expertise, because just by being in the role, I will be, I guess, passively gaining experience and expertise. But I think for most of us, if we recognize the importance of the growth of expertise, ideally, we want to speed that up a little bit. And so really this idea of and I got this from Sarah Cottingham, actually, this phrase of examined experience. So not just passively being in it, but proactively examining what happened, why it happened, what could be better. And so that was that. And then, of course, naturally you lean into things like kind of Kolb's reflective cycle, and there's lots of other models out there. But, if you haven't seen it before, this idea that you've had an experience and then you reflectively almost observe how that happened. And then potentially, if possible, you connect it with some theory or someone else's experience, so sort of some sort of conceptualization, but at an abstract level. And then you go back and try something slightly different, which then recreates that cycle. And so, yeah, for me, it was fascinating. And then start thinking about, okay, what does that examined experience do then? How does it, fast track expertise development? And I think there's naturally a deeper understanding. And it may be that the understanding is not of how to do it better. It's just a better understanding of yourself. Do you know? I mean, that's what I constantly reflect on around, why did that affect me so much, and why, and so on and so on. And then this idea of, if you can do this regularly, you may find there are some patterns to your behavior. And anytime you can do that is, I think, super helpful, because ideally we want, good ones. I guess we've talked a little bit before about this idea that knowledge is not fixed, and that constantly sort of pruning it. If you're doing it properly, you're never convinced that what you know is the truth. It's the truth for that moment. But an interaction with someone else, and this is the joy that we get to do a lot, is to speak to other people and have our knowledge slightly tweaked, sort of thing. And the last one I was thinking is this metacognition, which I sometimes giggle about this, because if you spoke to a teacher about metacognition, they would talk about their students.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't say their own metacognition. Yeah. And if I was to say we do a lot in our schools, this idea of, before a task, you ask them a question, the students, how are you going to prepare for this task? And then during a task, you do a monitoring question, how is it going? Is it working what you thought? Do you need to make any changes? And then the E question is evaluation, how did it go? But I wonder how many staff would be able to answer those questions, which would be hilarious. And so, that was where I came from in terms of the Launchpad. But why did it resonate with you?
Honestly, this is, let's be clear. All the Launchpads in your book are golden. This one is the one for me. And I have a love-hate relationship with this Launchpad, in the sense of, I hate it because I've literally just submitted my manuscript for my next book. This would have been perfect in it, because I think the way you describe, I love the graph. I think it's just so good. So I'm kicking myself for only seeing this too late, because I think it's brilliant, because I think experience does sometimes get confused with expertise. And from a psychological perspective, there's a whole bunch of reasons why experience can be valuable. So, for example, we know our memory gets distorted. So there's one really cool study where they showed people a car crash. And then a week later, they basically asked them different questions around, how fast was the car going when it crashed? Or how far was the car going when it bumped into the other car or smashed into the other car? Yeah. And they found just changing that little thing changed people's memory of what they saw. They kind of changed how fast they thought the car going, because we can't, and it shows we can't just rely on our own experience. We have to, as you say, examine it, right? Which I think is just such an interesting point, because that's really hard to do, because when I look at an event, I have my recollection of it, and I know my intentions. So like, let's say I was late for something, but I know that I was trying really hard to get there on time. So therefore, my experience of that event is, I'm a good guy, but I was a victim of circumstance. Yeah. Whereas because other people don't know my intention, they just go, Brad's really selfish and lazy because he was late. And so our experience isn't reality. Yes, it's really subjective, right? Yeah. And I think experience is really important. And I actually think we don't do a very good job especially in education, in tapping into the hard-earned knowledge that has been gained over years of experience. We often always want shiny new stuff. I think a lot of that expertise and experience is already in schools, but we have to critically examine it. I thought just the way you conceptualized it on the graph with that gap between the two.
That's interesting, isn't it?
I thought it was just a beautiful representation of something that's just so important, but often kind of going back to our first, that crystal ball question. Yeah. Because I don't feel like we often have enough time. No. That's often the thing I think maybe we sacrifice. We feel like we're not doing stuff if we just reflect on the previous thing, because we're always going on to the next one. So yeah, I thought it was just a brilliant launch.
I wonder if we could dip into your kind of psychological knowledge for a second, because I guess one of the things that's on my mind about this is, um, I have the benefit of having a coach, and we do a lot of coaching in our organization, and I've kind of, implemented a coaching model across our trust, and that adds a partner who can help you examine your experience. But if you haven't got that and you have to kind of reflect on your own, I would imagine that we're subject to quite a few biases, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'll give kind of two. There's loads of bias. So there's like confirmation bias. So I did X, Y happened. It's really easy to assume that X caused Y, so I'll just keep doing X. But often we know outcome can be really random. So there's this confirmation outcome bias. We tend to remember like the first or the last thing. So that kind of gets in the way of reflection. So for example, annual reviews are terrible because actually you only really get a review on what happened in the last 2 weeks, not really what happened in the year. There are some things you can do to help combat it though.
Okay.
So to give you an example, when I used to work in football, one of the players from Man United who I was working with, so football, a bit like leadership, is very outcome orientated. So like they always use this phrase, each week is like weddings or funerals.
Right.
If you win, you celebrate like it's a wedding. And if you lose, you commiserate like a funeral, and there's no middle ground, right? But both of those are really poor basis for self-reflection. So what we started to do with some of the players we work with is before every match, we'd get them to write down 3 objectives that they want to do, kind of performance indicators during the game.
Right.
And then regardless of the outcome, if they've won, if they've lost, if they scored a hat-trick, or if they didn't score at all, they'd have to answer the same 3 questions, which had been preset, so they weren't influenced by the outcome. And just having that rational, almost calm logic reflection. And then we had the same 3 post questions, which is something we actually got from the Red Arrows used to do this. So kind of like, what did you do that was really good? What could you have done differently? What are you going to do in training tomorrow, essentially? Right. And again, having that consistency regardless of outcome, it becomes second habit. I think it's kind of that metacognition you referred to.
Right.
I think that helps reduce the bias.
Yeah.
Because you're not so influenced just by emotions.
Yeah. And I mean, we're stepping a bit out of this. It sounded like, I mean, you know more about this than me, but this difference between performance and outcome goals, is that linked?
Yeah. And it's huge because ultimately people are judged on their outcome. Like you can't get away from this. It's actually quite a paradox. It's quite counterintuitive, actually. The kind of counterintuitive paradox is the less you dwell on the outcome and the more you focus on the performance, chances are the better the outcome will be. So it's a bit like we see the same thing actually with students. There's a really nice study about feedback versus grades.
Right.
So the more you focus on the feedback, the better the grade is.
Right.
But if you and the grade matters, right? But if you just focus on the grade, it actually doesn't help you get better grades. And I think the same thing happens with performance and outcome in sport, and I think it happens in leadership as well, is sometimes outcome can be random, but you're basically making your bet that over time, if you nail the performance, the outcome will matter. There's a great book called, what's it called? The Score Takes Care of Itself.
Okay.
Which is kind of a nice way of basically saying, if you can be so process focused, it's not saying the outcome, the score doesn't matter. Obviously it matters.
Yeah.
But you achieve it by nailing your performance and processes.
And that's an interesting reflection for leaders, I guess, because typically leaders set the goals and, that targets for people below them. And whether there should be a shift towards more, performance-related targets.
Well, I think it's good to have both. I don't think it's one or the other. So I think having the target provides clarity. Like you're providing vision of here's our ideal future state. Here is where we want to get to, and this is what it looks like. And then using that as the springboard or the launch pad, if you like, to what are the behaviors that we need to then do to get there? And those are the behaviors we're going to focus on.
Brilliant. Well, we could, we're going to have to do another episode and dig into this. Amazing. Well, let's keep moving because we're almost at the end actually of our time, which is sad for me. But of course, the last thing we do is the final, Fast Friends question. And so for the third one, Bradley chose, what personal quality do you feel you need to develop the most?
Lots of them. It's funny. I'd say top 2 probably. First one's probably patience. I think it's very easy to confuse ambition with impatience. So I'm ambitious, I want to do stuff. So therefore I feel if I'm not doing stuff right away, that feels the opposite of being ambitious for change. Yeah. Whereas actually some stuff does have to run its natural course and you can't force it. So I am very impatient by nature. Yeah. If I could also probably link to that, just like to be just a little bit calmer, tiny bit less emotional, a bit less reactive. I've always been in awe of people who can do calm strategy, logic. I'm a really good doer. Yeah. But having actually the kind of, this whole phrase, if you have to chop a log down, sharpen the axe for the first 9 hours, 10 hours. Yeah. Whereas like, I would get impatient not chopping down the log for the first 9. But just having that patience and that calmness to plan and prepare, I would love to develop that.
That's so funny. And again, it resonates a lot with me because I think we share that. I mean, it almost seemingly every year I tell myself, right, when you're in meetings, Chris, just listen a bit more.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Just again, and I can feel myself sat there thinking, just listen. I was telling myself these things.
And that's also one of the reasons why I actually struggle with coaching, for example, right? Because I too often want to jump in and go, here's the answer then. Let's go. I can save you this pain of this inner turmoil. Exactly. And also no one has time. So let's get going and do this thing, which is probably more of the sports coaching model. Whereas I think in leadership and education, that co-development and co-construction has more value. So yes, definitely areas to work on.
Well, that's a perfect place to finish because I think as leaders, we could all probably take some pressure off ourselves and collaborate more and see benefits in teams and benefits in others. And that's great. Well, the last thing to say then really is just to say thanks. And I'm sure loads of people are going to want to, talk more. How can they connect with you and InnerDrive?
Yeah, so thanks for the chance to do the plug. So our website is innerdrive.co.uk. We have hundreds of free resources out there that we just want to put good stuff out in the world. I'm on socials. There's not too many Bradley Bushes with a weird C in the surname. So people are more than welcome to reach out. We'd love to talk to schools and trusts who might be interested in training and staff development. But mainly just a big thank you to you for inviting me on. I hope I did it justice and followed on from the other good guests.
Yeah, a joy. And again, if the listeners have enjoyed this, the podcasts on the normal sort of streams and the books out there on Amazon, and you can kind of get it on the QR code. And like Brad, really, happy to connect with anybody on the socials. So thanks to everyone for listening. And I'll see you at the next one.
Thanks for having me.